and welcome to this special interview with Sir Mark Moody Stuart on his sustainability journey. My name is Muloongo Muchelemba, and I look forward to learning from our distinguished guest. So Mark Moody Stuart had a long and successful career with Royal Dutch Shell. He joined as a geologist in 1966 and worked across several countries in Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Asia Pacific. He became a group managing director in 1991 and became the chairman of the Committee of Managing Directors from 1998 to 2001. He served as a chairman of Anglo-American from 2001 to 2009 and has also sat on the boards of HSBC, Accenture, Saudi Aramco, the Global Compact Foundation, and the Global Reporting Initiative. I hope I've done that summary justice.
Thank you.
So Mark, it's wonderful to meet you.
It's a pleasure to be here and to meet you as well.
So you've had a remarkable professional career and continue to make a considerable impact on business and the sustainability agenda. Out of everything you've achieved, what are you most proud of?
Well, Muloongo, as you know, there's almost nothing one achieves by oneself. It's always with other people. As an old explorer, I know that who found an oil field? You know, is it the person who negotiated the contract, shot the seismic, drilled the well, drew the map? It's all of them. But there are things I'm proud of being part of with many others. And one is in Shell, in 1995, as you know, we had a terrible year with the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa and the Brent Spar, so an environmental and a human rights issue. And we were severely criticized. And we had thought we were doing a pretty good job. We had good business principles, which were well penetrated. We really thought we didn't interfere in politics. We didn't bribe people. But in reaction to that, we went out and consulted and asked, including many of our critics, what should we do to these principles to improve them? And they came up in workshops all around the world in multiple languages with cross-section of Shell people and outsiders, said, okay, there are three things. You have to be clearer about politics, because you are involved in politics. You're a political actor. Add sustainable development and add something about human rights. And we did that and went back to them and said, here we are. And they said, that's fine, couldn't do better, but they're just words. Now demonstrate, report. And out of that came the Shell report. I think the first one was called People and Planet and Profits, or Planet and Profits, Does There Have to Be a Choice? So what I'm really proud of that process was opening up and consulting with people who were critical, but were happy when asked a question to be consulted and to give us advice. And I think it was a real change, and I think it was, in the corporate world, something quite advanced. And I'm proud to have been a part of that. And I still make it a point, if I see a demonstration, I go over and ask them, what's the problem? You know, can we talk? So I think openness to other opinions and other people.
I think it's great. I mean, it leads into the second question, which is you published the book Responsible Leadership, Lessons from the Front Line of Sustainability and Ethics back in 2014. How have you seen the concept of responsible leadership evolve in the last 8 years?
Well, I mean, one big change was I have always been a great believer in engagement, in responsible business being involved in working in many different countries, so that by example, you can demonstrate that you can respect human rights in your own organization, you can have decent pay and conditions, good environmental performance, and so on. Now that, of course, the question is, what's a responsible business? And we could have another whole conversation about, you know, what keeps a business on the openness and reporting that you need to make sure that you are actually behaving responsibility and dealing with human rights organizations and making sure that they know what you're doing. But I've always been a believer in that. That's become very much more difficult nowadays. The world tends to have a reaction, you know, shouldn't do business in this country, you know, no business in Russia, almost shouldn't do business in China. Well, thank heavens that when, you know, Nixon and Kissinger went to China, they didn't say, you know, let's put sanctions on these people. They said, why don't we work together and grow something? Now, there are people nowadays who say, well, that was a big mistake, look what's happened. But actually, it was transformational in China. And China themselves, the Chinese nation, transformed itself and lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. So I think now we have to think of what one does to prevent this almost instinctive rejection of working anywhere difficult, saying, no, too difficult to work, let's leave. And that's no way for the world to come together, I think. So we need to think, how can you up front say to countries, this is how we want to work. If we're working in partnership, these are, and you lay that out beforehand. I mean, I remember when after we'd done the exercise I talked about just now, with the new business principles, we said, before we publish them, let's go and talk to countries where we have partnerships with state-owned organizations, and we want our partners to follow these principles as well. And I remember in China, we said, when we talked about support, what we called support for fundamental human rights, they said, now wait a minute, fundamental human rights, there are these 4 characters in Chinese, which if we translate them back into English mean human rights with a capital H and a capital R and all the Western baggage. And if that's what you want, the answer is no. But here are the same 4 characters with 2 extra characters, and I still have those on my laptop, which, if you translate it back, means that we are prepared to support individual and personal rights. So we went to the human rights organizations and said, look, we think this is progress. I mean, because the problem in many single-party states is that the individual gets crushed in relation to the needs of the masses. And if China is prepared to accept that to support individual and personal rights, we think it's progress. But we don't want you guys to accuse us of watering down our principles, especially for China. And the human rights organizations, bless them, said, no, we agree, go ahead. Interestingly, 15 years later, the person who negotiated that in Shell and discussed and has explained to me the meanings of the characters, says you could then, say 5 or 8 years ago, use just the 4 characters again. And the Chinese Global Compact Network actually themselves ran a workshop on human rights. So that was real progress. I'm not sure what's happened now, because China is moving a bit in another direction with President Xi, but certainly over 15 years it was terrific progress. As you can see, I have quite an admiration for China.
I can see that, as do I. Well,
Yeah.
I'm so glad you mentioned Global Compact, because that was going to be my next question. I mean, you've recently stepped down as the chairman of the Global Compact Foundation, and you mentioned in your book that the Global Compact is too important to fail. So my question to you is, what has the Global Compact achieved in the 22 years of its existence, and what more can be done to realize the original vision set out by the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan?
Well, it's achieved, of course, tremendous growth. So now we have 15,000 companies all around the world, big companies, small companies. It's never been concentrated in one block. It's not Western, Eastern, Northern, Southern, non-aligned. It covers every country. But it's still, of course, very small. The real achievement and the future lies in the local networks. I mean, the dream is, and we're close to it in a few areas, is to have an organization which has international business, national business, big business, small business in a local network, together with labor unions, if they're permitted, which of course they're not in every country, but some form of representation, civil society organizations as part of the structure. And that way you get an alliance which can encourage governments to do the right thing and which is trusted in a way that neither business alone nor civil society alone would be. And that you can then encourage governments which are doing the right thing and grumble a bit when they're doing the wrong things. And the collective approach gives cover. So that to me is, if we could build really strong networks in each and every country around the world, and that would be a mechanism for tracking and tracing the progress on the Millennium Development Goals, for example. So you could say, and it's so important, a local network can say, okay, of the 10 principles, what are the real issues in our country? Is it corruption? Is it environmental? Is it human rights? Is it working conditions? Unfortunately, in some countries, it's all of them, but even then, there would be priorities, and you can focus on that. And I think that in a national way, because the world is still depends very much on action in each and every country and town and eventually village.
Great. Well, thank you for that. So pivoting slightly back to your business career. So you had a long career with Shell. You sat on the boards of Saudi Aramco and of Anglo American. And my question to you is, how are extractive industries reconciling that tension between delivering shareholder value, which is mostly fossil fuel driven, and achieving the sustainability agenda?
Well, it is a challenge. If I go back to those Shell business principles, which were developed in the 70s, interestingly, not by the top of the organization, but by a man called Jeffrey Chandler, who subsequently was in Amnesty International business grouping. Jeffrey was, I think at the time, under the old Shell terminology, which was, I think he was probably external relations coordinator or something like that. And there had been a scandal in Italy, which involved all a corruption scandal, and he said, we need principles. So he produced, in those principles, which still exist, he addressed what we would now call stakeholders. So our employees, society, the governments which we work with, our shareholders, and so on. And he listed the responsibilities to each. And to the shareholders, he said, our responsibility to shareholders is to protect the value of their investment and deliver an acceptable return on it. And that's still, if you dig in the Shell website, you can find those principles. There's been one small change. Acceptable became competitive. I thought, well, that must have been an interesting discussion. Would I have put competitive? Well, yes. Acceptable means it has to be competitive, but competitive brings a bit of something else in. I think I would, on balance, maybe out of if someone said, what is acceptable, you'd say, well, it has to be competitive. But I still think I'd have stuck with acceptable. But actually, I think it's the best definition of our responsibility. And if we're in this transition, what we have to do is protect the value of their investment while delivering an acceptable return. So the acceptable return at the moment has been coming from the fossil fuel side, but if we don't transfer it and recreate new sources in sustainable energy, you know, we're dead, because, you know, this is coming to an end. Not as fast as people think, because we're going to need fossil fuels for quite a while, but it, you know, the writing's on the wall. As we saw in the 90s for coal, you know, I mean, Shell had a coal business in the 90s, and we sold it. We actually, I
didn't know that.
No, we actually sold it to Anglo-American. When I went to Anglo-American, some of my colleagues said, oh God, here he comes again, some of my ex-Shell colleagues. But it's, no, I think, now why did we sell it? Because we thought there was probably not a good future in it. So I'm not against divestment, you just need to know what to put your money in next. And so we need this change, and we have to use the cash flow. I mean, this is a mighty machines, the international oil companies and the national oil companies, and they have massive cash flow. And that has to be channeled and diverted. And the fascination is to see how each company is doing it in a slightly different way. I mean, Shell is doing it a lot less on actual generation of renewable energy and more on trading and how you blend it and make it work. Others, Total, is putting a lot of investment into actual generation. I don't know what's going to work, but it's, you know, one of them will, and some will not. I mean, will suffer. It's going to be fascinating, and the speed and how you handle it, I think it's a terrific challenge, and I would quite like to be, you know, part of that, or continuing to be part of that.
Oh, I certainly hope so. So you've seen, I mean, your travels have taken you around the world. What are you seeing in terms of how different countries and regions are tackling sustainability?
Yeah, it's fascinating, because different countries tend to pick on one item, and sometimes one thinks, oh, I wish countries would learn from each other. I mean, I remember in the 80s in southern Turkey along the Mediterranean coast, every single house had a solar water heater on. You know, those little round tanks with a panel in front of them.
Very common in Africa.
And yes, at that time, Turkey was way ahead of many countries, and it's such a good idea and so easy, but until it becomes kind of normal in a country, it doesn't spread. And you see China has a very rational approach. I mean, they planned this, they're criticized for continuing with coal, but in many ways, they have a bigger renewable energy industry, wind and solar, than anyone else, and they are the aces using actually Swiss technology, I think, for ultra-high voltage transmission lines, so you can take electricity from Western China, where the sun is still shining, when when the east, the lights are already on. So you can move, and that's an important technology. And they could do it in China, would be very difficult in the United States to build ultra high voltage transmission, long distance transmission lines, but it's really necessary.
Why? Why is that?
Just property rights and states across state boundaries and so on. It'd be quite tricky even in Europe, I think, although we are talking about it, building them from the sunny southern countries north, because, I mean, clearly if you want solar energy, you're better to stick the panels in the Sahara or Saudi Arabia and channel it north. And there are interesting calculations to show that this can be really economic. So again, in those countries, you have an emphasis on that, and then the whole fascination of using that energy and the surplus that you inevitably have at some times to convert into hydrogen, and really green hydrogen and so on. So I think the fascination is that many countries latch on to a particular item. And as I said, China has a very rational approach, and they set what I think is one of the most rational targets, which is to say they set themselves a target for energy per unit of GDP. They said we have to keep reducing the energy needed to produce 1 unit of GDP. I think they're the only country which did that, and it's such a rational solution.
Fascinating. So, I mean, it's great to hear all these examples from your business background and also seeing what other countries are doing. So the question I had for you was, one of the criticisms of sustainability is the emphasis on the future, with targets set into 2050, when we know most global leaders today will neither be responsible nor accountable then. Are we just kicking the can down the road? And is there anything we can do to bring the conversation back to what we're doing today?
Yes, I mean, I think it's a valid criticism. I think in order to make real progress, we need proper frameworks and planning by governments. Now, governments also have a short time frame very often, not everywhere. I mean, some countries, they go on forever, but nonetheless, the immediate future is of interest to most governments. And what we need is to encourage governments to have the courage to do things like, for example, setting a proper price on carbon. Now, if you say, let's have a price on carbon through a trading scheme or through a tax scheme and so on, you immediately get objections from different parts of society. You have businesses who howl and say, you know, if we do that, we won't be competitive, it'll cost employment and so on. And that terrifies government, so they go all weak at it. Equally, civil society says, oh, no, now you're putting costs up and it's going to drive inflation and so on. So I go back to what I was saying. We need alliances between businesses and civil society and labor unions, which say, okay, all of these fears have real bases in fact, but here's what we can do to balance them so that we can actually achieve something which we all then agree to support. And I think if one has an alliance of those, and one of the mistakes we made in the oil industry, and we make it in many different industries, is not to get together. We sit in our corner and say, yeah, what we need is to do is this. You know, we in business know what's needed, so that's what we should do. And we don't, and then we come out with the idea, and other people look at it and say, yeah, well, that was a business idea, so there's probably something to their advantage in it. If you could involve the others during the building of that process, it would be great. And the mining industry did this under Bob Wilson, who was executive chairman of Rio Tinto. He led, together with a very able person from civil society called Richard, second name has momentarily escaped me, who unfortunately died young of cancer. They ran a process called Mining, Minerals and Sustainable Development in Canada and elsewhere. And basically they said to civil society, look, we need mines, unless we're all going to eat with our fingers and so on. We need metals and mines. How do we do it properly? And out of that came the International Council of Mining and Metals, which is a CEO-led organization, which has done some great stuff, I think. And we in the oil industry never did that. We never had a real open consultation, both together ourselves and then with civil society. So, I mean, the one recipe I would have is say, let's try and form these alliances of business, civil society, labor organizations, which can work and encourage governments, because we need governments. I mean, people talk about, you know, we need less government and small government. I say to them, just try living in a country where there is no government or little government, and you'll know why we need government.
Absolutely, I agree with that completely. So pivoting to sustainability at the individual level, what does sustainability mean to you personally?
Well, at the encouragement of Shell Alumni, I did this footprint calculator. And I must admit, I thought I was, you know, pretty good. We have, you know, I drive an electric car. We've had a hybrid for 20-something years before that. I have ground source heating, a fairly energy efficient house and so on. And I did the footprint, and I was really shocked. I mean, my footprint is bad.
Me too.
Yeah. So, you know, I think and of course the key is, if everyone lived at my standard, I may think I'm pretty good, but if the whole world, all 7 or 8 billion of us live at that, we'd need 2.9, I think I am at. And I run out of space in May. Really quite shocking. So now I'm kind of going back to the drawing board saying, right, now what is it? Travel, you know.
I think that's what got me.
It does get, and I have to admit, when I reported a bit the last couple of years, so I wasn't traveling too much. So that was a bit of a cheat, probably. If I'd reported previously, I'd have been much worse. And we do go sailing. I've had, for 40 years, I've had a sailing boat, which my wife and I sail, which is, you know, we sail, don't motor, but we fly there. And giving that up, you know, would be a big sacrifice. So I have to think about that.
What about food? Because that's one of the big struggles.
Yes, food is also.
The calculator asks about eating plant-based foods and processed foods, and how far does your food travel? And I think that's also where I fell flat. Yeah. I don't know what your...
Well, I mean, we eat quite a lot of local food, but we do, of course, eat meat. So clearly, you know, I should cut down on the amount of of meat that we eat, which is, not so difficult because there are delicious vegetarian alternatives or plant-based alternatives. So I think that's, so we've got, and of course that's one of the difficulties. We tend to do things which don't really make us uncomfortable. I mean, we're not, we're pretty incremental, I think. And that's me, not just everybody else.
Well, what I really liked about Footprint Calculator is that it raised awareness of what my contribution is to this problem. Yes. Because one of my frustrations is that when people talk about sustainability, it looks like something that's discussed only at the UN General Assembly, at the stage in Davos. But what are we doing as individuals? How can I be involved? How can my family be involved, friends and colleagues? So the question to you is, how can we actually get everyone to be involved? Because it's without everyone's participation, we won't actually realize the sustainability agenda.
Yeah, I think we need to go back to communities and more community activity. And in our village in Sussex, for example, once a month we go on all the roads and lanes and pick up the litter. And it's appalling when you see the amount of rubbish people throw out of their car windows. So we are all appalled by that, but we've got to get the folk in cars recognizing that. And then, it's the amount of one-time use plastic that we use, and that's, so I think society and communities and getting together so that it's kind of normal helps. So that would be, my recipe would be, can we work more to rebuild communities, which certainly in Europe and North America, to some extent, I think we've lost. I mean, one of the things that Africa has retained is family values and families and the importance of family. And in some of our societies, we've really lost that, which is very damaging. And it's not just our family; it's the community.
As an African, I could not agree with you more. So it's been fascinating hearing from you on sustainability. In closing, is there one thing that you'd want us to start doing today?
Yeah, I always say, let's listen to others, listen to people we disagree with, or who disagree with us, or who criticize us, and try and understand what has, if we think they're mistaken in their criticism, they're not just making it up. They have a clear impression that we, either as individuals or as business people or as companies, are doing something. And that impression comes from somewhere. So what are we doing to give them this impression? Is there something we should do differently? Or are we sure that we aren't really doing what they're saying, So I think the capacity to listen and not go defensive and take offense at criticism, but open up and say, well, what do you mean by that? And so on. So I'd put listening And that would include, of course, listening to the needs of people. And we haven't been very good at that. If you look at the global reaction to vaccines, I mean, you know, we look after ourselves pretty well. And, you know, I've had 4 vaccines, and, you know, the average person in many other countries has had, you know, only a couple of people in 100 have had any at all. And that's awful. And it's not in our interest.
Not as we increasingly become global, it
No,
isn't.
No, exactly.
You literally cannot avoid your neighbor.
No, exactly.
It goes
yes.
back to community. We
Yeah,
are a
no,
global community
yeah,
now.
No.
Well, it's been fascinating talking to you. And
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time and sharing your wisdom, and we hope you continue to enjoy your retirement.
Well, it's always a pleasure to talk to a Shell colleague, as it were, an ex-Shell colleague. I know we didn't overlap, but still, we have something in common.
You definitely do, and your legend definitely lives on within the Shell community. So thank you again.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.